Well, I thought I'd talk about one of the parameters of Buddhism, the one called Kshanti, which means patience or forbearance. I suspect you all know what 6 parameters are, so I kind of won't go into great detail about it, but this one seemed particularly relevant for myself and maybe other people during this time. Patients having to wait to find out what the next policy is, on the lockdown, or how it's going to loosen up, and not just that, but underneath that, I think, is a certain sense of loss of control. That quite literally, the government can pass a law that means you can't go out or catch a bus or anything, and so maybe it brings up something underlying that's always there, really. I think it's interesting that Kshanti, or the parameter of patience, it doesn't quite translate just as patience as in you patiently wait for something to improve. It includes aspects of like forbearance, like not responding immediately, not overreacting. Also includes things like tolerance of difficult situations and acceptance, and also just pure endurance. And one of the scriptures that I have been finding useful and came up for me to do with patience was the Diamond Sutra. This is Red Pine's translation, which is very good. It's quite a challenging section where he's talking about the parameters, the perfections, and the Buddha's talking to the disciple Subhuti. And he says, Subhuti, the Tathagata's perfection of forbearance is actually no perfection. And then he tells this story from one of the Buddha's past lives about King Kali and the ascetic Kshanti. He says, and how so, Subhuti? When King Kali cut off my limbs, my ears and nose, and my flesh, at that moment I had no perception of a self, a being, a life, or a soul. I had neither a perception nor no perception. And why not? At that moment, Subhuti, if I had had the perception of a self at that moment, I would have also had the perception of anger. Or if I had the perception of a being, the perception of a life, the perception of a soul, at that moment, I would have had the perception of anger. It's kind of a rather extreme example from the Buddha's past lives, and apparently it's to do with the Buddha's life when he was an ascetic called Kshanti, which means patience. And he was sitting in meditation in the forest somewhere, and a king comes along with all his harem, his kind of concubines, and apparently the king falls asleep, but the concubines and etc. are so struck by the peacefulness of the ascetic that they offer him all their flowers, and they're kind of sitting around him, adoring him, listening to his teaching. So the king wakes up and is furious that he's not being respected, and his women are kind of venerating this ascetic. So he decides to starts chopping off the limbs of this ascetic one by one. Anyway, and that's where you get the situation that the ascetic doesn't show any anger. I mean, maybe the story is not that important, but it's pointing at something. And I found the commentary on this very useful as well. It talks about different kinds of patience. And say there's the patience of the suffering of human affairs, and I guess that would include things like trying to get on in life, trying to keep our career going and our family at the same time. All those kind of difficulties, and there's the sort of material suffering we have to be patient with, just feeling too hot or too cold, for example, illnesses, aging. But the last form of patience is patience or endurance in the face of what they call the birthless nature of all dharmas, i.e. the emptiness of all things. So the deepest form of patience is to show forbearance in the face of the emptiness of all things. And I kind of like to talk about these different levels of this. I think they're all relevant. It's not saying necessarily that one's better than the other. You know, how do we experience this in our lives? I think it points, these levels, I don't know if they exactly correspond to what happens in our lives, but there are different experiences where we have to show patience. I think, you know, in some situations we can cope with, say, someone is angry in front of us, like our boss at work, you know, by counting to 10 or whatever technique we want to use, so we don't immediately react. We give ourselves time to sort of simmer down. And that's a good skillful means, and I'd say that's being patient in the face of the suffering of human existence. You know, it's very good. I think we can also use various skillful means, and there's loads of self-help books out there where we can remind ourselves with sort of rational arguments that we don't need to get angry. Like, if there's quite a lot of Buddhist teaching that says we don't really need to get angry with other people because they only make us angry because they're suffering themselves, you know, so we can convert that into compassion. And that's, again, you know, very useful. But I'd say it's only taking it to one of these levels of patience. And I personally find that even if I manage to control myself or persuade myself that I don't need to get angry, or, you know, my anger's not justified or whatever, often the resentment can catch up with me later. You know, I can maybe deal with the boss at work, and then, you know, later on in the evening, I'm just absolutely furious, really. And it seems to put the problem off, in a sense. I think the deeper level to that is when we start seeing how, on a micro level, you know, a moment-to-moment level, we keep building up our own anger and resentment by repeating justifications for, you know, why it was fine for us to actually get angry. And that's a deeper level, and it starts to look at why the great need we have to be loved and respected, I guess. And that helps to move the anger away from the specifics. But I still think it doesn't quite deal with the problem. I think it kind of leaves like an elephant in the room, if you like, that we still haven't talked about. And perhaps, you know, the COVID-19 epidemic really brings this out, because in the end, whatever situation we're in, we're not in control. You know, we basically cannot get what we want, or we cannot control things. We cannot protect ourselves completely. There's no such thing as a kind of place of safety in that sense. And all the methods we choose kind of get us through the day, but we're kind of left with that feeling of perhaps dissatisfaction because it's still there. I find it very useful. I don't know if any of you have caught there's a Guardian article by Oliver Berwyn, who actually quotes Ram Master G. Kennett, and it's quite nice. He quotes her as saying something like, her teaching method, it wasn't to lighten the burden of her students, to take the burden away from them, but to actually make it heavier so they were willing to put it down themselves. So they chose to put it down. Sounds like typical Ramaster Jew, actually, in some ways. So I think that Kshanti, or forbearance, in the face of what is called the birthless nature or emptiness, is a bit like this. we can try and make ourselves feel a bit better and in control by using all sorts of rational arguments. But the goal itself of complete safety is always an illusion that we can never reach. And maybe actually confronting this and putting it in a way that may seem to make it worse to start with is a way of dealing with this more directly. And I think I can come back to that, but just to expand a bit on what I think it means when he says that the deepest form of patience is patience in the face of the birthless or emptiness of dharmas. I don't know how familiar you all are with the scripture Great Wisdom, but a dharma can just mean anything, really. It can be a person or a feeling or an object. So all objects are empty. And this is what scripture Great Wisdom is talking about when it says, O Sariputra, here all things are pure, for they are neither born nor do they wholly die. They are not stained nor yet immaculate, increasing not, decreasing not. Master Ji's translation here says that here all things are pure. But a lot of other translations say here all things are without characteristics, i.e. you can't define them. And that includes people or our own emotions even. So we have to show patience or forbearance in practice when our image of things is threatened, because our image of things depends on putting a label onto a situation or a person. And we try and pigeonhole things or people. And that's part of our normal survival strategy. We say that someone is that sort of person and we either kind of like them or dislike them. I know that's not a very subtle way of putting it, but I think there's some basic truth in that. But we're often faced with situations where this solid image of people is threatened. Also, the image of ourselves as having a substantial self. And I think, this can be especially true when, people age and their personality can change quite drastically. If they get dementia, for example, they can be different from day to day. I know this from personal experience. It's almost like, one person I visit with dementia, it could be different 3 times, different person almost. And, but, rather than kind of let our heads go around in circles about this, why not see it as being patient in the face of the birthless nature of all dharmas? Because this is showing that our labels and categorizations of things, people, just don't apply. I mean, all things are pure in the sense we can't grasp them. And in a sense, we do miss that purity by trying to pigeonhole them. Another aspect of this is the patience or forbearance we need to feel in times of accepting our own fear when we're faced with difficult situations. The situations where the rug is being pulled out from underneath us, the reality is shaken, is actually a time of insight. And that's, if we can learn from that when we show forbearance, when we don't react to these times with anger or I don't want to face it. So Kshanti, I guess, is really important in that by showing forbearance in the times of these difficulties, and I think current epidemic is one of those, we actually are able to learn from it, learn about the emptiness of all things, which in the end, when we really understand it, is a positive thing. Most commentaries on Scripture Great Wisdom say that it's an actually quite frightening teaching on many levels. If you partially, if you start to understand what it means, you should really be frightened because it's threatening the ego. But if you take it on its deepest level and you can endure with your own fear, then it becomes the ultimate sort of refuge. It says, you know, a layer of all suffering great wisdom is. I just wanted to maybe bring, at the end here, just bring this down to perhaps how this plays out more in, you know, Zazen and our practice. And, you know, I did say that Kshanti or patience isn't really about waiting for things to improve. And I think that's very significant because it's more about understanding or seeing the birthlessness of things in the moment. And on one level, we're very aware of how one thing causes another. There's a sense of continuity in time. And I guess, you know, just taking, say, meditation or say a time of retreat, often, you know, or the beginning of a meditation period, there's a stream of thoughts and feelings, and it does seem like one thought or feeling is kind of knocking onto the next one. There's a kind of domino thing, you know. It's a bit warm tonight, and I start thinking about, you know, wouldn't it be nice to be somewhere else? Wouldn't it be nice to be cooler? Then I start thinking about my, you know, possible times away, and then I start thinking, oh no, I can't go away because I can't travel on public transport, etc. And then I start complaining about the government. So you can see there's a sort of chain of causation. But if you allow that to settle down and just keep sitting, you know, follow the instructions and don't hold on to things, don't push things away, then you find out there's more and more gaps in that kind of seeming continuity. And that sense of continuity is very important for a sense of a self. And if you remember in the teaching in the Diamond Sutra, he says, the Buddha says, I didn't feel angry because I had no sense of self. In a sense, when we start to see these gaps or realize that in a sense we are creating this continuity of self, that it's quite illuminating actually, that at some point we often realize that when the gap arises, we have to fill it up all the time. You know, there's a gap there. We say, oh no, what do I do now in the meditation? So I think, oh, I must think about something, and at least I'm still here, kind of thing. And that's quite significant. So, you know, forbearance in the face of emptiness is partly going through that and allowing that to happen, that kind of fearful period, and not worrying about it too much. And I think once you get a sense of that, it's you can simultaneously both be aware of the sort of flow of thoughts and feelings, because they don't stop in a sense, but they're not really connected to each other, and there's something else that just remains completely still. Master Harrier recently compared it to like running a tape through a cassette tape recorder, and luckily I think most of us are old enough to know what a cassette tape looks like. But you know, there's the tape that goes round, a little bit of magnetic tape, and then there's the head that reads it. And he was saying, you know, the stillness is like the head. It's aware of the time going by, but it's completely still. And I think this points to what other people call, like Reverend Master Daishin calls, sufficiency in the moment. The part that isn't really involved and doesn't really care about what's the tape that's going by is sufficient, and it's not really dependent on time, or, you know, it's not one thing that's caused by another thing. And I think that kind of positive sense of the sitting is really another way that this very strong sense of a soul or a self gets undermined. And it's pointed to a lot in Dogen, you know, when he talks about firewood doesn't become ash, for example. I can't remember which chapter that's in. He also says life does not really become death. So, you know, if we can get through the forbearance in the face of emptiness, in the face of very difficult times when we feeling undermined, we can find that place of a stillness.